Welcome to Lesson 3G. When we have the number 3 plus a letter, we're going to focus on specific muscles. I'm going to teach you about the muscles of the legs, and I've narrowed it down to 4 main muscles that control our movements. The first muscle at the top back part of your legs is the gluteus maximus. The second is a group of muscles at the front of the legs called the quadriceps. The third group of muscles is on the back of the legs, and they are called the hamstrings. And finally, the muscles at the bottom part of the leg, the main part of the calf, are called the gastrocnemius. Before we start with the gluteus maximus, I need to point something out. It's almost impossible to work out the gluteus maximus without working other muscles. Many of the gluteal movements also use the quadriceps, and many of the other gluteal movements also use the hamstrings. And some of the gluteal movements also use the quadriceps and hamstrings within the same movement. Now let's get to how to exercise the gluteus maximus with pushing movements. This image that I will continue to refer to shows the proper leg bend and flat back posture for the bottom end of most pushing movements. In other words, this is the good form that your push movement should have when your legs are bent. One of the more common ways you can do a push movement with your legs is with a seated leg press. The movement is simple. All you have to do is sit down and push your feet away from you. Even though that this is a popular exercise because it is simple and good for beginners, it usually ends up working the quadricep muscles a bit more than the gluteus maximus muscles. Notice the angle of our legs that we are pushing from before we push our legs to straight. Though the full name is a seated leg press, most people just call it a leg press. Even though the gluteus maximus is contracting in this exercise, the main muscle group that gets most of the work during this movement is the quadriceps. The next pushing movement with your legs is a lot more complicated and a lot more effective for your gluteus maximus and all the other support muscles in your leg. It's called the squat. Squatting requires a lot of balance and flexibility. It is a more advanced lift than the leg press. But as you notice, you still have the same starting leg angle before you push. Though most people just call this a squat, technically it is a barbell squat because we're squatting with a barbell. These are called dumbbell squats. You can see from the dark color red on the gluteus maximus muscle that it is getting a lot of work during this movement. All these variations of squat are a good way to work your gluteus maximus as long as you don't mind working your quadriceps and your hamstrings as well. This is a body weight squat. Usually people stick their arms out for balance. Another variation on the same lift is called the front squat, and the only difference is that you put the bar on the front of your chest instead of behind your neck. Once you move the bar to the front squats tend to work your quads more than they do your gluteus maximus. Take a look at the image on the top right of this picture. Most of the time people put something underneath their heels, like a board or some weights. Boards are used to help balance and flexibility. As you can see, we are still working with the same pushing angles. There are different ways to hold a bar during a front squat. Also, placing a bench or a seat behind you is good when learning squat form. It also helps with safety. The next variation on a push movement is called the deadlift. The biggest difference is that the bar starts on the ground instead of on your shoulders. And when you're standing at the top of your movement, you slide your hips forward and squeeze your glutes before dropping down and repeating the movement. This movement works your gluteus maximus even more than the squat does, and also involves the hamstrings more than the quads. The red colored muscles are the ones that are working during the deadlift. The darker the color red, the more that muscle benefits during the movement. Here are some more variations on the deadlift. On the left side, you have a single dumbbell deadlift, and on the right side, you have a double dumbbell deadlift. The next push movement comes from the same push angle, but this time it's one leg at a time. This push movement is called a lunge, and we use one leg at a time. Sometimes we step forward to lunge, and sometimes we step back to lunge. In review, as you noticed, all the push movements started at a similar angle. And during the push movement, we went from bent to straight and back again. Sometimes the quadriceps were more involved, and sometimes the hamstrings were more involved. The gluteus maximus was always involved, but how much depended on the exercise. Last but not least, this image is the best way that I know how to exercise the gluteus maximus without a leg push movement. As you can see, there's a little bit of hamstring involved in the movement as well, but it is the closest that we're going to get to isolating the gluteus maximus. As we move away from the gluteus maximus and to the quadriceps and hamstrings, I want to point out how you isolate the quadriceps with an extension and how you isolate the hamstrings with a curl. The only way to isolate the quadriceps is with some form of leg extension, like in this image. Notice how the pad of the extension machine is sitting on the top of the feet. When doing a leg extension, you extend the legs by kicking the legs out and going from bent to straight. Once your legs are straight, contract, squeeze, and tighten your quadriceps for a second before relaxing and then repeating. The only way to isolate the hamstrings is with some form of leg curl, like in this image. Notice how the pad of the curl machine is now behind the foot. When doing a leg curl, you curl the legs back toward your gluteus maximus and bend your legs as much as possible. Once your legs are as bent as possible, contract, squeeze, and tighten your hamstrings for a second before relaxing and repeating. The rest of the leg movements involve both the quadriceps and the hamstrings. I'll point out which movements focus more on which of the leg muscles. The leg press tends to focus more on the quadriceps than it does the hamstrings. This is a quarter squat. It's called a quarter squat because you go a quarter of the way down. When you only go down a quarter of the way, you only work your quadriceps. Once you go down past the quarter way point and you get down to the halfway point, that's when you get your hamstrings involved and your gluteus maximus involved. This is a good look at the angle you have to get down to do a half squat. Here is another example of a half squat versus a quarter squat. The half squat is on the left, The quarter squat is on the right. As a general rule, the deeper you go, the more you get the hamstrings involved and the gluteus maximus involved. These next movements are more hamstring than quadricep. These last few movements are all hamstring, no quadricep. Let's finish up with the gastrocnemius, and let me show you how to isolate the gastrocnemius muscle. The movement is called a calf raise. When doing a calf raise, let the muscle stretch down as far as it'll go, then get up on your tiptoes as if you're looking over a fence. You can also do these calf raise movements while sitting down. Last but not least, stretching the legs. I'm not going to give you too many images of people stretching their legs. Keep it simple when you stretch. Make the muscle as long as possible, for as long as possible, preferably at least 30 seconds. The muscle in red is what she is stretching. She is stretching the gluteus maximus. In this image, the man is stretching the quadriceps. In this image, the focus are the hamstrings, but she's also stretching the gastrocnemius and gluteus maximus as well. In this image, he is pulling back on his toe to make his gastrocnemius as long as possible. See you next time. Don't forget to take the quiz.